Have you ever believed something so deeply that you never stopped to question it? Not because it was proven true, but because everyone around you seemed to accept it as fact. Have you ever absorbed an idea about a group of people so quietly that one day you realized it had shaped the way you looked at the world without you even noticing? And what if I told you that a single decision made in complete secrecy by one of the wealthiest men in America was about to expose how wrong that belief really was? For years, there has been a quiet injustice hanging in the air around Filipino nurses. It was never written in law. It was never said directly. It lived in subtle tones, in hiring rooms, in conversations that ended with polite smiles. People would say Filipinos were kind, reliable, hardworking, but then they would add something else, almost automatically. They are good, but not the best. They care, but they are easily replaced. They speak English, but not like we do. It was a soft insult, repeated so often that it began to sound like common sense. What made it dangerous was the illusion that everyone believed it. Hospitals in America, Europe, and the Middle East quietly depended on Filipino nurses to keep their systems alive, yet rarely spoke of them with reverence. Families trusted them with the lives of their parents and children, yet seldom asked who these caregivers really were. The world seemed to agree, without ever voting, that Filipino nurses were essential, but invisible. Then something happened that didn't fit the script. In a private hangar in the United States, a Gulfstream jet was being prepared for takeoff. No press, no cameras, no announcement. Just a flight plan entered into the system. Destination thousands of miles away, across the Pacific, toward a country most billionaires never thought twice about. The passenger list was unusual. No CEOs, no politicians, no investors. Just one name: a Filipino nurse. The man who ordered that jet was not known for sentimental gestures. He was a titan of industry, someone who measured decisions in efficiency, risk, and return. People like him did not spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on flights unless there was a strategic reason. And yet this flight was personal. Deeply personal. At first, even those closest to him didn't understand. Why her? Why now? Why go to such lengths for someone the world had taught him was replaceable? The answer did not begin in wealth or power. It began years earlier, in a hospital room filled with the quiet hum of machines and the kind of fear that no amount of money can silence. It began with a man who had everything the world could offer, slowly realizing that none of it could protect him from pain, uncertainty, and loss. And it began with a Filipino nurse who did something so small, so human, that it would eventually move a billionaire to do something no one saw coming. Before the jet ever took off, before the secret was revealed, before the world was forced to look again at the Philippines, there was a moment of care, a moment of faith, a moment that would quietly change everything. The billionaire's world had always been built on control. Control over numbers, over outcomes, over people. From the outside, his life looked untouchable. Private security, boardrooms overlooking cities, doctors who answered calls in the middle of the night. But illness has a way of humiliating even the most powerful. When his condition worsened, when treatments that were supposed to work quietly failed one by one, control slipped through his fingers faster than he could buy it back. Hospitals in the United States were efficient, spotless, impressive on paper. The best technology money could access surrounded him. Yet the days felt cold. Conversations were rushed. Care came in shifts measured by schedules, not by presence. Nurses rotated in and out, polite but distant, trained to do their job and move on. He noticed how often they avoided eye contact, how quickly silence returned once vitals were checked. For the first time in his life, he felt like a file, not a person. When his family pushed for second opinions abroad, the story repeated itself. Europe offered prestige, but no warmth. Japan offered precision, but no reassurance. Everywhere he went, he was treated as an important patient, but never as a frightened human being. Nights became longer, the fear became heavier, and somewhere between procedures and consultations, hope began to thin. It was during one of those long nights that he met her. She was not assigned to him permanently. She was covering a shift. A Filipino nurse with a soft voice and steady hands. At first, he barely noticed her, until he realized she was the only one who stayed after her tasks were finished. She adjusted his blanket without being asked. She spoke to him, not about charts, but about how the night air felt colder than usual. When he struggled to sleep, she did not rush to sedate the problem away. She sat. She listened. He later tried to remember what exactly she did that night, and he couldn't isolate a single grand gesture. There was no dramatic speech, no miracle cure, just something unfamiliar. She treated him as if his fear mattered. Over the following days, he began to notice patterns. She prayed quietly before starting her shift. She spoke about her family back home in the Philippines with pride, not complaint. She never spoke of herself as someone beneath others, even when the system treated her that way. When he asked why she chose nursing, her answer was simple. It was a calling. What unsettled him most was learning how difficult her journey had been. Years of sacrifice, long separations from family, endless exams and retraining just to be trusted in foreign hospitals, all while carrying the weight of expectations from home. And yet, she never once spoke with bitterness. In moments when his strength failed, she became his anchor. In moments when hope felt irresponsible, she quietly restored it. And without realizing it, the billionaire began to question something he had never challenged before. What if the world had misunderstood people like her? What if the Philippines, a country so often overlooked, held something the rest of the world had lost? The question stayed with him long after the night lights dimmed and the machines continued their steady rhythm. By the time his condition stabilized, the billionaire realized something uncomfortable. The treatments had helped his body, but it was her presence that had steadied his spirit. When she was reassigned to another unit, the room felt emptier, even though nothing else had changed. The machines still hummed, the doctors still came and went, yet something essential was missing. For the first time in his life, he felt the absence of someone who had never asked him for anything. Curiosity, once ignited, has a way of refusing to stay quiet. He began asking questions. Where did you learn to care like this? How did you stay this patient? Why do you pray before every shift? Her answers were never rehearsed. She spoke of growing up in a small community where neighbors shared what little they had, of Catholic faith woven into daily life, not as performance, but as habit. Of nursing school in the Philippines, where compassion was taught with the same seriousness as clinical skill. She spoke of Manila not as a place of chaos, but as a city of resilience. What surprised him most was her humility. She never claimed the Philippines was better than anywhere else. She only said it taught her how to see people fully. To her, care was not a transaction. It was a responsibility entrusted by God. After his discharge, back in a world of board meetings and private flights, her words lingered. He found himself replaying small moments, the way she lowered her voice when he was afraid, the way she remembered details no chart recorded. It disturbed him because it challenged a lifetime of assumptions. If one nurse from the Philippines could restore something he thought was gone, what did that say about the place that formed her? Weeks later, against the advice of his advisors, he did something unexpected. He traveled quietly to the Philippines. He did not announce his arrival. He did not bring an entourage. He wanted to see without being seen. In Manila, the air felt heavier, louder, more alive than anything he was used to. Traffic pressed in from all sides, streets pulsed with movement. Yet, amid the chaos, he noticed something familiar. Faces that met his with warmth, not suspicion. People who smiled without reason. He visited a hospital where Filipino nurses trained. He watched young students bow their heads in prayer before exams. He saw instructors speak not just about procedures, but about dignity. In a small chapel near the ward, candles burned quietly, each flame representing a burden carried with faith. Nothing about the facilities impressed him by Western standards. The equipment was modest, the halls were crowded. But something else filled the space. Presence, attention, humanity. For the first time, the Philippines was no longer an abstract idea. It was real. It was tangible. And as he walked through those halls, listening to laughter mixed with prayer, a realization began to form. Perhaps what saved him was never just one nurse. Perhaps it was an entire culture of care the world had underestimated. And deep inside, something shifted. Not fully yet, but enough that he knew his life was no longer moving in the same direction as before. The longer he stayed, the more the Philippines stopped feeling like a place he was observing and began to feel like a place that was quietly observing him. Without realizing it, his pace slowed. The urgency that had governed his life for decades softened. Mornings no longer began with calls and numbers, but with the sound of church bells drifting through open windows and the low murmur of prayers spoken by strangers who treated faith not as an escape, but as a source of strength. He returned to the hospital several times, not as a benefactor, not as a man of influence, but simply as someone who wanted to understand. He watched nurses greet patients by name even when the ward was overcrowded. He saw them touch shoulders gently, listen without glancing at the clock, laugh with families who had nothing left but hope. These were not gestures taught in elite seminars. They were instincts shaped by hardship and belief. One afternoon, he witnessed a moment that would stay with him forever. A nurse knelt beside an elderly patient whose family could not afford extended treatment. There were no dramatic words, just a quiet prayer, whispered with sincerity. The patient smiled through tears. The nurse smiled back, as if suffering was not something to fear, but something to walk through together. In that instant, he felt something break open inside him. He thought of all the places he had been, all the systems designed to optimize care, and how none of them had prepared him for this. This was not efficiency. This was presence. This was humanity practiced daily, without applause. As days passed, he found himself drawn into small routines, sharing meals with staff who insisted he eat first, listening to stories of nurses who sent most of their earnings back home, not out of obligation, but love. Hearing how faith carried them through exhaustion, separation, and grief. They spoke of joy as something chosen, even when circumstances were cruel. And slowly, almost against his will, he changed. The fear that once consumed him loosened its grip. The bitterness he carried toward his own vulnerability faded. For the first time since his illness began, he felt whole. Not because he was healed, but because he was no longer alone in his suffering. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the city settled into its restless rhythm, he sat quietly and admitted something to himself that shocked him. He had traveled the world chasing success, believing it would protect him from emptiness. Yet here, in a place the world often overlooked, he found what wealth never gave him: peace, meaning, belonging. He remembered the Filipino nurse who had first sat beside him during his darkest nights. He finally understood that her care was not exceptional because she was unique. It was exceptional because she carried the values of a people who refused to let hardship harden their hearts. In that moment, the transformation was complete. He no longer saw the Philippines as a footnote in global narratives. He saw it as a quiet force, restoring faith in humanity, one act of compassion at a time. And he knew that whatever he chose to do next would be shaped forever by what this country had given him. When he returned to the United States, the distance felt greater than the miles suggested. His home was the same. The view from his windows had not changed. The world still treated him with the same deference it always had. But something inside him no longer fit the life he had stepped back into. The noise of privilege felt louder now, the emptiness more obvious. He realized that while his body had been treated by the best systems money could buy, his spirit had been restored somewhere else entirely. He kept thinking about the Philippines, not as a destination, but as a reminder of what happens when care is not outsourced to systems alone, when faith is not hidden, when kindness is practiced, even in exhaustion. He thought about the nurse who had never once asked for recognition, who never imagined that her quiet presence would ripple outward in ways she would never fully see. And he understood that survival was only part of the story. What the Philippines had given him was the will to live differently. Months passed before he acted. When he did, it was done the same way everything meaningful had been done from the beginning. Quietly. No headlines, no press releases. He arranged for a private jet to fly one route, across the same ocean he had crossed searching for answers. This time the destination was reversed. The passenger was the Filipino nurse. When she was told, she thought it was a mistake. People like him did not do things like this. Not for nurses. Not for anyone without influence. But when she arrived, he did not greet her as an employer or benefactor. He greeted her as someone who had changed his life. He told her what he had never said out loud before, that in his weakest moments, she had given him dignity. That in a world obsessed with speed and status, she had shown him what it meant to truly see another human being. He did not offer her wealth as repayment. He offered respect, opportunity, a chance to lead programs that trained caregivers the way she had been trained, with compassion at the center. And he made a promise, not just to her, but to himself, that he would no longer measure success only by what he built, but by who he uplifted. For him, the story became larger than one nurse or one act of gratitude. It became a message he carried quietly into rooms of power. That the Philippines, so often underestimated, had preserved something rare. Faith under pressure. Kindness without condition. Strength that does not need to announce itself. For Filipino viewers, this is not a story about a billionaire's generosity. It is a mirror held up to a truth you have always lived. That your values matter. That your care travels farther than you know. That even in a fractured world, the Philippines continues to restore what others have lost. And for those watching from elsewhere, perhaps the question lingers. In a time when humanity feels fragile, where should we look for hope? Sometimes the answer is not found in power or wealth. Sometimes it is found in the quiet faith of a Filipino nurse who never knew the world was watching, but lived as if every life in front of her mattered.